Okay, good morning to everyone. I hope I can be heard and connection is good. Welcome to this book launch with some reactions coming from leading thinkers in the Philippines. The book written by Murray Hybert, Under Beijing's Shadows, Southeast Asia's China's Challenge. But allow me also to use this opportunity to thank Bauer Group Asia, who is sponsoring this virtual town hall discussion with us this morning and this evening in the US. You know, the emergence of China and its increasing role in the region have prompted a blend of anticipation and unease among Southeast Asian countries. Although the region has benefited from China's economic growth, its militarization of the South China Sea, and its expansive economic agenda under the Belt and Road Initiative, among others, have raised skepticism in the country's outsized ambitions. Just in the Philippines alone, the crowding presence of Chinese paramilitary vessels, the continued harassment of Filipino fishermen, and the failure of Beijing's economic concessions to materialize these past 4 years are just some of the acts done by China against the Filipino people. This event aims to tackle China's evolving strategy and its many dimensions, and how this affect Philippine national interests and the overall regional security architecture. Allow me to welcome everyone. We had 308 registered participants, and it's not limited. To the Philippines, but we have had registrations from all over the region. We've also had registrations from different networks, news networks, both local and foreign networks. So allow me to welcome all of you and thank you for registering. Thank you for participating. But I will pass it on to the chairman the CEO president of the Bauer Group Asia, a member of the board of trustees of Strat-based ADRi Institute, and the former senior advisor and director of the Southeast Asia program of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Our co-sponsor here, Ernie, welcome, and we're hoping to hear from you with your remarks and comments.
Thank you very much, Dindo, and good morning, everyone in Manila, and good evening to anyone participating from the United States or Europe. I'd like to thank the Strat-based Albert Del Rosario Institute for co-sponsoring this event with us. To hear from the author, Murray Hebert, who's a dear friend, colleague, and really an inspirational leader when it comes to understanding how the United States, Southeast Asia, and China will work together, compete, and set the world, the geopolitical context for the world. I think as we think about the future of Asia, Southeast Asia is the geopolitical center of the world right now, where the Indian and Pacific Oceans meet, right where the Philippines is situated, is the most important part of the world today. And Murray's book looks carefully at the issues related to how China is operating in Southeast Asia and how Southeast Asia reads and is reacting. And that's very important for the United States. And I'll just say, calling in from Washington, that we have 50 days to our presidential election, Dindo, and we are China is front and center in the political dialogue in the United States, and while it's less known and understood, Southeast Asia is absolutely as critical as China is to understanding our future in Asia. And Murray's book does great service to that. But I'd like to say one thing before we start, and then that is a dear thank you to my friend and really a man who has inspired a lot of us in the United States who work on Asia policy and business, and that's Albert Del Rosario. He was ambassador to the United States. That's when I met him, and then he became foreign secretary of the Philippines. And I've never seen someone with so selfless a sense of patriotism and courage to stand up to insurmountable odds and assert his country's interests. And as you went through the tribunal and the court case in The Hague, Albert Del Rosario and his team stood tall, not only in the Philippines but throughout Asia and globally. And it's such an honor to serve on the board of the Strat-Base ADRi Institute with Albert and with Dindo. And I really am looking forward to the discussion today, hearing Murray's comments about his book, and then hearing the responses and insights from people like Justice Carpio, who's been a great leader in Manila and globally on the legal issues surrounding the South China Sea, and the likes of Renato de Castro, who's a good friend and obviously one of the most important political commentators on these issues. So I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you for teaming up with us, Dindo, and including Bauer Group Asia. We're proud of Murray, who's our head of research, for publishing this book. He worked very hard on it over the course of the last several years, and I wish him every success in the publication and of the book, and hopefully everyone buys a copy of his book. That would be the most important thing to do to help him out. Thank you again for including me, and Dindo, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Ernie. Now we move on to our keynote address. We have asked our chairperson at the Strat-Base Albert Rosario Institute to deliver a keynote address. Former Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Albert Rosario, ADRi. Secretary Albert.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry for the glitch. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to our forum, with special greetings to our distinguished Washington friends, persons of Ernie Bauer and Murray Hyper. Thank you, Ernie, for your most kind words. And to all others, we are honored that you could join us today. I've been asked to keynote today's forum, and as we see it, recent events may have fundamentally altered world affairs. The US and several European and Asian countries now squarely confronting China for its persistent violations of international law, especially in the domain of human rights, territorial integrity of states, and the law of the sea. It's important that we continue to address this issue because our quest for justice will shape the future of our world and our country's place in it. For our part, we continue with our own efforts to demand accountability from China ever since it started in the 1980s to take away land and waters in the South China Sea belonging to Filipinos. Part of our efforts is the March 13, 2019 communication that former Ombudswoman Conchita Carpio Morales and I had filed with the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. This communication describes how China President Xi Jinping and other officials committed crimes against humanity by intentionally depriving Filipinos and other coastal inhabitants of the South China Sea of their food resources and livelihood. In the words of the ICC statute, these are, no doubt, inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental or physical health that must not go unpunished. We're all familiar with China's continuing unlawful oppression in the South China Sea. These include preventing our fishermen from pursuing their livelihood in Scarborough Shoal and in our West Philippine Sea, blocking the development of our natural resources, mercilessly destroying our marine environment, erecting military facilities in our waters, and ridiculously confronting our president with the threat of war. China's hegemonic agenda in the South China Sea prejudices more than half of our country's 110 million population who live in coastal communities, relying on marine resources for their daily needs and survival. If we recall, on December 5, 2019, the ICC Office of the Prosecutor released a report raising some jurisdictional concerns on our communication. The office also informed us of these concerns in a letter dated November 27, 2019. The Office of the Prosecutor stated that for the ICC to take jurisdiction, the crimes described in the communication should occur in Philippine territory, which includes its territorial sea. On December 13, 2019, we responded to the ICC prosecutor that we intend to submit a more extensive discussion on why the acts of China officials described in our communication fall within the territorial jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, consistent with Article 12(2)(a) of the Rome Statute, as well as give new facts and information to supplement our communication. Thus, if it is shown that the crimes described in the communication occurred not only in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, but also within its territorial sea or landmass, the ICC has basis to proceed with our communication. We are submitting our response this week to the International Criminal Court's prosecutor, and I am happy to announce that Justice Tony Carpio has agreed to join our quest for justice as our counsel in this ICC case. Justice Carpio is a legal luminary with unparalleled wisdom and expertise in the South China Sea issue, and he will surely bolster our efforts in the ICC. In our response, we demonstrated that the crimes against humanity committed by Chinese President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials and agents occurred not only in the EEZ of the Philippines, but also in the Philippine Territorial Sea and the coast of Luzon. First, part of the destructive, massive illegal reclamation and artificial island building undertaken by Chinese officials in the Spratlys occurred in Subi Reef, which is within the territorial sea of Pagasa. Pagasa is Philippine territory with a permanent community of Filipinos and is controlled and administered by the Philippines. Second, Chinese officials continue to enforce its hostile blockade within the territorial sea of Scarborough Shoal that prevents Filipino fishermen from pursuing their livelihood. These fishermen live along the coast of Luzon and rely on their fish catch to survive. The effects of these Chinese criminal actions therefore extend to the Philippines' coast of Luzon. Third, over 322 Chinese militia vessels have conducted swarming activities in the Philippines territorial sea and shores of Pagasa for more than 600 days since 2018 and remain in the area indefinitely. These illegal Chinese activities are meant to intimidate Filipinos, harass those Filipinos living in Pagasa, and prevent fishermen from pursuing their livelihood. Fourth, the June 2019 ramming of FB Gemver in Reed Bank, where 22 Filipino fishermen were left to die until they were rescued by a Vietnamese fishing vessel and ultimately recovered by the Philippine Navy. While this occurred in the Philippine EEZ, this falls within ICC jurisdiction because the Chinese committed this crime against a Philippine registered vessel. We also included senior executives of China Communications Construction Company, CCCC, given the confirmation that CCCC and its subsidiaries undertook the massive and destructive illegal reclamation and artificial island building in the South China Sea, which has caused devastating and long-lasting damage to the marine environment and the livelihoods of countless fishermen. These facts are straightforward because they are based on publicly available evidence, and a number of them have been judicially vetted in the South China Sea arbitration. We therefore believe that ICC has a strong basis to proceed with our case. The end purpose of our ICC case is to hold Chinese President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials criminally liable and be penalized by imprisonment pursuant to the ICC statute. They planned it, they implemented it, and they continue to commit their crimes against Filipinos and all the coastal inhabitants of the South China Sea. Given the global repercussions of Chinese actions, we believe that our case fulfills the founding purpose of the ICC, which, as stated in the preamble of the ICC statute, is to punish the most serious crimes of concern to the international community and to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of this crime. As our case progresses, warrants of arrest may be issued against the individuals who we identified as being responsible. This effectively prevents persons like President Xi Jinping and Wang Yi from traveling to ICC state parties like a number of European countries, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, because such countries will be obligated by the ICC statute to enforce the arrest warrants against them. We urge our neighbors in the South China Sea, who are also aggrieved by China's actions, to submit similar communications with the ICC to make Chinese officials accountable for their atrocities. We pursue this case on the premise that we Filipinos should not sit idly by as China continues to flagrantly destroy our rights. Through our private efforts, we continue to work to protect our country's rights and to make China pay for its atrocities against the Filipino people. We're heartened to know that, as of now, nearly 100,000 Filipinos have signed an online statement of support for our efforts to hold Chinese President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials criminally liable for their actions in the South China Sea. We believe that our countrymen are true patriots in their hearts, and when push comes to shove, they will truly fight for the Philippines, a country we love. We hope that our government will join us in this quest for justice. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, there are those who think the rule of law in international relations does not apply to great powers. We reject that view. International law is a great equalizer among states. It allows small countries to stand on an equal footing with more powerful states. Those who think might makes right have it backwards. It is exactly the opposite in that right makes might. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Albert, for your keynote address. Allow me to proceed with our program and introduce the author of the book Under the Beijing Shadow, Southeast Asia, Asia's China Challenge. A good friend, Ernie Bauer mentioned him as the head of research of the Bauer Group Asia. I've known Murray for years, constant visitor in the Philippines, as he was active in the Southeast Asia program of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So Murray, welcome, and I turn it over to you. Good evening to in your end.
Yeah. Thanks, Dindo. Thank you, Dindo and Ernie for co-sponsoring this event by Bauer Group Asia and the ADRi Institute. I'd also like to thank Secretary Del Rosario for his interesting and important and timely opening remarks. Before I start my talk, I'd just like to take a moment to remember Eileen Baviera, who helped me a lot in the research and tragically died of COVID several months ago.
Yes.
Real tragedy. My book, as is been suggested a few times, is an effort to figure out how Southeast Asian countries, country by country, are responding to China's rise. And one of the things you find very quickly is that they see a lot of opportunity because China has grown economically so phenomenally in recent decades, but they also feel somewhat intimidated, anxious about what China is going to do with all its power. And China really does show up in the region now and with its full toolbox of diverse equipment and tools to engage Southeast Asia, from soft power, including economic cooperation, cultural exchange, education, hard power, including military threats in the South China Sea, which Secretary Albert referred to, military sales, military exchanges. What I'm going to do is go through quickly the main themes of my book, but I'm going to try to use mainly Philippine examples. And to do that, though, I have to say a little bit about the Philippines and before I start in the general summary. But it's clear that the Philippines is somewhat unique in Southeast Asia, especially the last few years. Probably no Southeast Asian country has changed its relations as dramatically with China as has the Philippines. After China snared the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012, President Aquino brought a case and Secretary Del Rosario brought a case against China, which prompted Beijing to seek to punish Philippines in various ways, including cutting off fruit exports, stopping tourists, stopping much of the investment, that kind of thing. Then after President Duterte took office just a few weeks before the arbitral tribunal, and he said he would pocket the ruling, separate from the United States, and told China, I will be dependent on you for all time. Despite that abrupt pivot, Duterte has gotten precious little aid and investment to boost the economy. And China did not relent in its assertive activities in the South China Sea around the Philippines and the other claimants, as Secretary Albert already outlined. Economically, though, since Duterte's pivot, Philippines has benefited to some extent. Most countries, or all countries, in fact, have benefited from China's rise economically. Philippine two-way trade with China rose to 60 billion in 2019, up from about 46 billion in 2014 2014 before Duterte took over. Tourism jumped to about 1.3 million in 2018. That's more than double what it was in 2015. And that's a real boost to the Philippine service economy. Although that number still really lags far behind Thailand or many of the mainland countries. Many of the Chinese tourists come here, come to the Philippines. I don't know, I almost feel like I'm over there talking to you, but many Chinese tourist gamblers many Chinese tourists come as gamblers to take advantage of the large gaming resorts around Manila Bay. In 2018, China's FDI, for foreign direct investment, reached almost 200 million, up from 29 million the previous year. But that leaves China still way behind. China is much more of a trading juggernaut than an investment powerhouse throughout the region. Still trails Japan, Singapore, US, in most countries. But Philippines is still way behind many other countries. The 200 million is compared to Malaysia, which is almost 5 billion, is only 1/25 of what Malaysia is. One of the key areas through which China invests is its Belt and Road initiative, which is its signature vehicle through which to invest. But one of the things that surprised me doing my research is how hard China has to work at getting traction and getting projects taken off. When it wanted to get its high-speed rail in Laos going, it had to negotiate for 5 years over the interest rate, how much land China would get on each side of the railroad, that kind of thing. And Laos is not viewed as a big economic powerhouse that's going to push back on China easily. In Indonesia, the high-speed rail from Jakarta to Bandung has gone very slowly since 2015. It was supposed to be done by Jokowi's re-election campaign last year, but it's in the Philippines. In Indonesia, China has a lot of trouble with land, getting access to land. Farmers don't want to sell it, and so it struggles. And then in a few examples, China has also got caught out in some pretty significant corruption and hefty kickbacks. This we saw probably most clearly in Malaysia's East Coast Rail Link that it negotiated with former Prime Minister Najib, and that was then renegotiated by Prime Minister, now also former Prime Minister Mahathir. Mahathir and his aides found that China had way overcharged, and that it was basically siphoning that money off to Najib, both to pay off the debts of the One Malaysia Development Berhad, 1MDB, State Investment Fund. And Laos, the special economic zones on the border are also vehicles for a lot of corruption and kickbacks to officials. The Philippine story is unique in quite a few ways. As has been alluded to, several people have mentioned, Duterte visited in October 2016, visited Beijing, and he came home with 27 MOUs for investments totaling 24 billion for rail projects, ports, hydropower plants, mining projects. And at the end, almost nothing has been implemented. Since that trip by Duterte, China has completed one loan for 62 million to build an irrigation scheme close to Manila, and 73 million for small bridges. So that's like 130 million out of 24 billion. It's and really it has had the Chinese have had a lot of problems getting liftoff. A lot of reasons for that, rather. It's tough in the Philippines often to get approvals. That's partially why Ernie has his company operating here, and Dindo has his company. There's a lot. They have trouble. The Chinese companies have trouble raising funds. and they've run into Philippine changing regulations. But still, yeah, it's a tough environment sometimes for some types of companies. But the Philippine people could really be forgiven for wondering what the heck was going on, why Beijing and Duterte didn't move heaven and earth to get at least a couple of projects off the ground to benefit, to show people what the benefits are of siding with China, abandoning the United States. But no, that didn't happen. Then there's also quite a bit of activity in the digital Silk Road, where China in Southeast Asia is quite active. It's a very big investor in both Singapore and Indonesia, and in investing in many startups. Huawei is also active in 5G, artificial intelligence, facial recognition. Alipay is really taking off in the region, including in the Philippines. The one investment that seems to be taking off in the Philippines is in the digital space, and that's China Telecom, investing over $5 billion with ethnic Chinese businessman Dennis Wee, who comes from Davao, to establish Ditto Telecommunity, the third telecom provider in the Philippines, which Duterte intended to compete with the two main providers, PLDT and Globe. There were some protests from security officials, former security officials, about the joint venture getting approval to install communications towers on army bases. But in the end, that went through, and Huawei, about which Trump has raised very serious security concerns, has contracted to set up 5G networks for all three mobile networks in the Philippines. I talk a fair amount about ethnic Chinese in the book. In all the countries over the centuries, millions of ethnic Chinese have migrated to Southeast Asia. Some Chinese were already living in the Philippines when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. Today, some 2% of the Philippines, 105, 110 million people, are ethnic Chinese. Some came a long time ago, centuries ago. Some are more recent arrivals. And they play a very significant role in many sectors of the Philippine economy. But about 1/10 of the total are new migrants, some of whom came in the 1980s, and some came after 2000 when China had a going abroad initiative that propelled a lot of Chinese to move to Southeast Asia and other places. Earlier arrivals of Chinese have identified themselves as Filipinos, and they're fairly neutral on the Philippine relationship with China. More recent migrants are much more bullish on China, and we've seen the Federation of Filipino Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, who are very critical of some of President Aquino and Secretary Del Rosario's policies toward China, but they're very supportive today of Duterte's rapprochement efforts. The one area where I don't think it's been paid enough attention to, and that is the spontaneous migration of migrants moving into northern Myanmar, north of Mandalay, northern Laos, the northern provinces, Vientiane, Sihanoukville, Phnom Penh, Bangkok, Manila, in the Philippines and in Cambodia, especially in Sihanoukville, in Cambodia. Most of the new arrivals are involved in online gaming, which has brought hundreds of thousands of ethnic Chinese to Manila and places like Sihanoukville and Phnom Penh. There's every country in the region has had a very unique history with China. I'm not going to go through all of it for the purposes of time, but in 1949, when the communists took over in China, they supported communist forces against most of the countries in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, where after Philippines got independence, they were quite active in supporting the Communist Party of the Philippines. But that continued until the 1970s, and then 1975, Marcos became the second ASEAN leader to recognize China, which was probably a little surprising at the time. He even beat the Thais, who were also moving quickly and were a few months behind Marcos. The opinion polls, especially elite opinion polls that are published about the region, show that, that the elites in the Philippines, like in most countries in the Southeast Asia, are quite wary of China. They are maybe not as wary as some, but in the Philippines, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore does annual polling, and the polls that were released in early last year suggested that showed that I should just define elites, that's officials, former officials, academics, business people, journalists, civil society leaders, various opinion makers in these countries. And 66% said that they called China revisionist power intent on turning Southeast Asia into its, quote, sphere of influence. 61% of Filipino elites said that China had the most economic influence in Southeast Asia, and 41% said China had the most political and strategic influence in Southeast Asia, which was actually just a bit higher. The political and strategic influence in Southeast Asia, China rated higher in the Philippines than the US, which came in at 36%. And almost 80% said that Philippines should be very cautious in negotiating Belt and Road projects with China to avoid getting into, quote, unsubstantiated debts. Military to military ties have also grown very quickly in between China and Southeast Asia for the most part. Not as quickly as economic ties, but exercises, arms sales have grown substantially. Thailand, after the 2014 coup, bought 28 tanks and ordered 3 submarines. Malaysia has bought 4 coastal patrol vessels, but China's military sales are still just a tiny fraction of what the US sales are. Duterte has called regularly for the military to step up its engagement with China, but the military is still in many ways much more closely aligned with the United States, so has been quite reluctant. But Duterte has called on the military to begin, despite China's threats that Secretary Albert outlined in great detail. He still urges them to do drills with the exercises with the Chinese, and look for do some training, of officers in China. But in 2003 to 2016, which really is before Duterte took office, Philippines was the second least military engaged country with China in Southeast Asia, behind only tiny Brunei. But since Duterte took office, China has provided some assault rifles worth over $6 billion, and Duterte credited China with providing the weapon that killed the Mote brothers in Marawi in Mindanao. But despite Duterte's personal tilt toward China, he's letting the military continue modernization of particularly Navy and Air Force platforms, which have largely been focused until now on providing security against China. And Rene de Castro has been one of the leading descriptors of what the Navy and Air Force modernization. Soft power is also a big deal for China. The latest year for which I have figures for all the countries is 2016. But in that year, it had 68,000 Southeast Asians but only 3,000 were from the Philippines compared to 23,000 from Thailand and even 11,000 from Vietnam. It has established Confucius Institutes, of which there are over 30 in Southeast Asia, 15 in Thailand, 5 in Malaysia, 4 in the Philippines. And then the Chinese also have really stepped up invitations for visitors to come to China. This has included party officials, academics, journalists, religious leaders. But bizarrely enough, when Duterte celebrated his PDP-Laban party's anniversary in 2018, the guests of honor were a Chinese vice minister, the Chinese ambassador, and an academic who gave a lecture on Xi's The Book of Governance. And then the Book of Governance, translated into English, was handed out to all the attendees. I have tried really hard to figure out to what extent China is using its political clout to influence activities in Southeast Asia. You see it to some extent, but not nearly as obviously as it is in what was in Malaysia or it's been in Singapore. In 2018, during the elections that ultimately defeated Najib and brought Mahathir back to power, the Chinese ambassador was very active campaigning for the ruling Barisan, the senior leadership. And when Singapore and China were in a spat or in a down period, very down period after Singapore called on China to implement the rule of law and follow the arbitral tribunal ruling in the middle of 2016, China pressed Singapore, couldn't get very far, and then it turned to the businessmen and warned them that Singapore is the biggest investor in China, and it warned the businessmen to that if they wanted to continue their prime spot in China, that they should really get their government to change its behavior toward and its views toward China. When I was doing my research, I ran into all kinds of rumors about the Chinese funding Duterte through some ethnic Chinese business people in Davao. But honestly, that's only rumors. So that's only a rumor. Don't quote me saying that, as that's true. I'm going to conclude with talk a little bit about water, which has become a very big challenge. Secretary Albert talked quite a bit about the South China Sea. I'm just going to mention for our Philippine audience that the Mekong countries are also facing increasing challenges from China. China has built 11 dams on the upper reaches of the Mekong, and it's been involved in building 2 in Cambodia. For the last few years, there's been a drought in Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam along the Mekong. And China said, well, we don't know what's going on. We also have a drought. And it took until a group called Eyes on the Earth launched some satellite photos over the Mekong dams in the upper reaches of the Mekong and found that China was hoarding voluminous amounts of water. Between 2 dams, I think it's the 7th and the 11th, they hold enough water to fill the whole Chesapeake Bay, the bay that's between Washington and the Atlantic Ocean, and it's that's an awful lot of water, and it could really be helpful. The drought it affects rice farmers and fishermen along in Thailand and Laos. But in Cambodia, it means that the famous Tonle Sap, which is a freshwater lake in the middle of Cambodia, that has, during the rainy season, water enters the lake and goes one way up the river, fills the lake, and then in dry season, the water returns. Well, that's not all that's going on. That is a major mechanism for spawning a fish. And when the fish don't have that opportunity, that means they are spawning far less, and there's far less fish in both going up the Mekong and going down the Mekong. And then, of course, the the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam is very affected by, it's below sea level. And so when water levels are low and silt coming all the way from Tibet doesn't arrive, it is very vulnerable to salt water entering from the South China Sea. And the Mekong Delta produces about 60% of Vietnam's food. And so that's really very critical. About 2 or 3 weeks ago now, the Asean, the Mekong foreign ministers approached the Chinese minister Wang Yi, and he agreed finally that they would provide data to the Mekong countries about what's going on and how much water they're holding back. But I would just like to make the case that countries that are not along the Mekong in Southeast Asia it would be useful for them to join in. This is going to become the next South China Sea unless this problem is resolved. And if the disputing countries want help from the Mekong countries on the South China Sea, it would be really useful to aid them here. When I understand when Vietnam raised this at the ASEAN meeting in June, the other countries, several other countries blocked it from being raised. And I know that Secretary Pompeo talked about the Mekong, but I didn't see much evidence that the Mekong was very big in the final communique. And I won't say much about the South China Sea because I think Secretary Albert did a great job of summarizing the problems. I'll just go back and talk about a little bit about what happened in 2019, beginning in 2019, when that June 9th, 2019, Chinese trawler collided with a much smaller Philippine fishing vessel near Reed Bank and throwing those 22 fishers into the water. That was that was 1 month after China had begun harassing with Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia vessels, Shell, which was operating off the coast of Sarawak and Borneo, what Shell was doing exploration activities, and it harassed them. Then on June 16th, a week after the ramming of the barge, it began harassing Rosneft, the Russian company that was exploring for oil and gas off Vanguard Bank, off the coast of southern Vietnam. So it is clear that China is really pressing to gain full control of the resources. It really thinks, it seems like it thinks, it doesn't say this, but it seems like it thinks the fish and the hydrocarbons inside the 9-dash line are theirs. So China's actions off the coast of the Philippines matter a lot because the Philippines really would like to develop the Reed Bank oil fields so that it can replace the Malampaya gas fields, which are running out of gas to power the capital city of Manila. But all the deals that Duterte has been able to get out of the Chinese about allowing Philippines to move forward involve some kind of a joint venture. And Philippine experts like Justice Carpio, I think speaks that right after me, have argued that joint development is illegal under Philippine law unless China recognizes Manila's sovereign rights over the area. So the Philippines is literally over the barrel in the Reed Bank, and it's going to hurt the Philippines economy. So I think I'll stop there. Dindo, back to you.
Yeah, Mary, maybe before we proceed, maybe you can show us a copy of your book, or even tell us how we can order or purchase it.
Boy, my picture, oh, I'm up here. Let's see. Well, I have one someplace, but okay. I'm having trouble getting my picture to increase in size. Sorry. Well,
Or maybe
anyway, here it is. If you can see it, it's a whopping 550 pages without footnotes. Several people thought I was crazy, but there's a lot to say about China's activities
that's right.
in the Southeast Asia region. The best place probably to buy it from overseas is Amazon. You can buy it. You can buy a Kindle version. I hope it's good news and not incompetence, but Amazon tells people in Japan that they have to wait a month. It tells people in Vietnam they have to wait 2 months. I haven't heard somebody tell me they've tried to buy it on Amazon in Manila yet from Amazon. I don't know how long it takes. I'm hoping it just means the book is selling like Cracker Jack, and the publisher and Amazon ran out. And I hope it's not just incompetence and the world shipping network being overloaded by people buying stuff now during the lockdown. But thanks for asking, Dindo.
Yeah, thank you for that, Murray. I'll ask my colleague, Richard. I think there are some questions for you. Richard?
Hi, Murray. Sorry, I was a little bit late. I was coming from 2 other talks, but let me congratulate you on your new book. Although it seems I've been looking at like 3 books on this issue. All of them have dragon. I just got the dragon and the deer. Now there's the dragon and and the countries in Southeast Asia. So this seems a very exciting topic. And I remember back in 2017 or 18, we had this talk in DC where you were, I think, still working on this book.
I was just starting then, yeah.
Yeah, you were just starting then. We were having questions about this issue. I mean, the first question I have before going, I mean, there are a ton of questions here, but they're quite interrelated. We have around 20, 25 minutes on that. Is there something that surprised you in the process of writing the book? Because I think this is an experience that a lot of people who write books have, right? Like you start with certain assumptions, and once you finish the book, then you come up with some new realizations. Or was there something that surprised you in the process of writing and researching this that went against your initial impressions or impressionistic understanding of the region?
Yeah, I guess a lot of it was a rather small things, but some of the bigger things were how hard, and I mentioned this, how hard China has to work to get its Belt and Road projects off the ground. I was also surprised, like in the Philippines, that how little China has actually done. I mean, it just blows you away that they have got Duterte to sell his soul, basically, and his first grandchild to China, and he is, just they're just not really working that hard. Now, of course, some of those MOUs, many of the MOUs that they signed in 2016 were quite bad. So many of them involved either CCCC or some of its affiliates. One of the things that I just stumbled on by accident, and it isn't directly related to this topic, but I did not know that Thailand, after in the 50s, was struggling whether to go with China or the United States. It was irritated that China was arming the communists, the CPT in Thailand. The foreign minister and some of his top aides spent a lot of time talking to the Chinese, including they saw Chou En-lai in Bandung in 1955. And he invited them to come and visit, and they had secret negotiations at the Myanmar, at the Chinese embassy in Myanmar. But then there was another coup, and what's his name? As Pibo Songkram was overthrown by, oh boy, I forgot who overthrew him in 1957. But that put an end to it. And he threw some of the guys that were involved in prison. However, when Lyndon Johnson, this ties to the U.S. So then they pivoted to Thailand pivoted to the U.S. and supported the Vietnam War effort. But Lyndon Johnson in 1966 is running into problems in Vietnam. It's unpopular. He's having trouble domestically. And so he somehow heard that there were these ties. So he drafted a letter and had it delivered to a guy named Sang, who was a top aide to the foreign minister. And he traveled to China with a letter that said, can we talk about normalization? And can we, this was 1966, 3 years before Kissinger visited. And can we talk about how to wind down the war in Vietnam? This guy arrives in Beijing the day that the Red Guard took over the foreign ministry, and this guy was not able to meet Zhou Enlai. And that's one of those what might have happened questions that you face in history, right? If something like, if that had happened, that was probably the most blow holes in my socks kind of development. But I was surprised, exactly all the little things the Vietnamese do to avoid falling under China's umbrella. But then also the other one that surprises me is Myanmar. I would have thought that after they kicked out the Rohingya in 2017 and gotten in so much trouble in the US and in the West generally, even in places in Indonesia, that they would have gone off with the Chinese, that China would have gotten some of its big projects off the ground. So it had the big Chakpu port that it's been wanting since, the 20 knots. And they wanted to build a big 6-berth port that would cost about over $7 billion. And then Thein Sein, with less than a month to go in office, signs an MOU and basically hands it over to Aung San Suu Kyi. But she and her staff don't move ahead with it. And finally, China had to come up. The Myanmar economic advisors to Aung San Suu Kyi, helped by some foreigners, of course, they negotiated it down with China to less than 1.3 billion, a much smaller port. And they basically have no sovereign debt over the project. China has to bear most of it. I would have thought that Myanmar might have, under all the pressure they faced, have agreed to this early on, but it stood up to them. And I realized gradually over the last few years of doing my research that Myanmar can be just about as nationalistic as the Vietnamese, which I guess I didn't quite realize before.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Murray, for pointing that out. And I think I also raised that with conversation with the Chinese that, when it comes to regional regimes, it's when you talk about performance-based legitimacy, it's not only a question of economics, it's also a question of nationalism and national sovereignty and integrity. And that's where agency and sentiments of smaller countries in the region cannot be underplayed. Now, the other thing is, of course, this is a very diverse region, no question about it. And within each country, there's tremendous amount of diversity. But are there certain more hardened, more crystallized divisions that we see in Southeast Asia in terms of classification? I mean, there are many ways, like some put it as China hawks versus China doves, archipelagic Southeast Asia versus continental Southeast Asia. There are many kinds of permutations of those classifications. All of them are problematic in one way or another. But if you were to make any kind of more hard divisions in the region, what are these divisions or classifications, or what framework do you adopt to make sense of
that's really tough? Because yes, like you say, the countries vary among themselves. And then they have people that are inside, even officials who are in very different places, even tiny Laos. You can find officials who think this going off with the Chinese is crazy and it's going to cost them. And that's true in basically all the countries. Hun Sen is probably he's probably gone the furthest to the, should we call it the dark side? The Thais too are surprising. The Thais have this soft spot for China in many ways. I think partially because Bangkok is at least a quarter Chinese, right? They've all intermarried and taken Chinese names. Half the time you don't know somebody's Chinese until their mother dies or something. You're invited to a funeral and you end up at a Chinese temple rather than a Thai temple. But the Chinese are livid that they are not completing the high-speed rail. So the Chinese are going to have a high-speed rail from Kunming to the border just south of and east of Vientiane. Well, what are they going to put on that train? I mean, are the Lao going to send them mangoes and sticky rice or what? You know, they don't produce that much in Laos. You have some beautiful textiles, but they don't need a train to move. And, you know, that you ask the Thais and they just say, well, China wants to charge too much. They insist on using their own engineers. They insist that we borrow the money from them, even though we can get it more cheaply on the international market. They want us not to bid out the rolling stock. They want us just to buy from them. And so they've had over 20 rounds of negotiations and it's not going anywhere. And I do understand that from sources in Bangkok that the Chinese have lobbied the government to fire its top transport people because they feel they're anti-Chinese. Yeah, I don't know. You know, I mean, you know, Indonesia is a very tough nut too.
Right.
It's the biggest country. It's where, for the first time, Jokowi really wants a lot of investment in infrastructure. But it's really interesting that Jokowi, who has been accused himself of being ethnic Chinese, being a Christian, especially in the 2014 election, he has pushed China really to the margins. So they're involved in Sulawesi, Northern Kalimantan, and Northern Sumatra, the islands that are the most far away from Java, where it wouldn't offend people in Java. But even in Sulawesi after COVID, so they shut down the Chinese mines in Sulawesi, and then the Chinese start coming back, and the local population is protesting because they fear, well, they're all coming back. We don't get jobs in these projects. We can work in mines, and we want jobs. And why are you bringing Chinese over here to do that stuff? So it is just really, even, you know, low level, you know, just the ordinary population in Sulawesi can get irritated about China. Malaysia has had its complications, for heaven's sake. Malaysia, where, you know, that I think Najib just was too gung-ho, seeing the Chinese as a gravy train to fill his coffers on 1MDB so that he could somehow escape from being caught out totally as having absconded in the order of $4.5 billion. You know, was a lot of concern about China after that. China's role in the elections really irritated a lot of Malaysians. So it's really, China, I would say, one of the conclusions I'd come to is that China is basically tone deaf. And I think a lot of people say that about Americans too. It's you know, big countries think they're great and they have so much to offer, and they don't really hear what the locals are saying. And I think if China could learn lessons of what's happened over the last, since they got going on the Belt and Road and started to do soft power stuff, they could learn a lot.
Yeah, the other I mean, the new cottage industry also right now is, you know, kind of looking at the contours of the international order amid the pandemic and what could come next. From your understanding, what is going to be the major implication of this COVID-19 pandemic? Is it going to strengthen China's hands, or is it going to weaken China's hands? Or is it more like in the short run, it may benefit China, but down the road, it could actually sow the seeds of a backlash? I mean, how are you looking at that? Because I think this pandemic is just a huge shock that could resettle these broader structural trends, this longerie analysis that we tend to adopt in analyzing China's longitudinal influence in the region. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. You know, I guess I thought initially, I mean, countries are hurt by it, right? The guys on the border is largely just starting to open, that travel is still banned, so that the Chinese tourists aren't coming. So it's having a huge impact, especially on mainland Southeast Asia, the countries that are very close. But the COVID has actually come with, it's in tandem with the growing U.S.-China trade spat, which I think has been exacerbated by COVID. Trump has used the used the term Wuhan virus, thinking that might help him with his voters in the U.S. But the irritation in the U.S. About China, its long-term stealing of intellectual property rights, forced tech transfer, its subsidizing of state-owned enterprises to compete, picking winners and giving them huge access to capital. That's really is basically a bipartisan issue now. And you can see Biden is also now talking about Buy American and reshoring companies. I think companies, as a result of COVID, some will migrate out of China. But the numbers are probably relatively small. The AmCham in Shanghai had a survey that was released early this. Where are we? I think it was over the weekend, over the last weekend. 70% said they weren't moving of the American companies that are members of Shanghai AmCham. 4% said they were, and 30% said they were still undecided. So it's about 2/3 aren't moving, a third maybe, some will. Part of the problem is they need the China market. It's also very costly and very slow to move your supply chain. So some are going to move to Vietnam, and some are moving, but they're finding Vietnam doesn't have the infrastructure, doesn't have, China has, if you're assembling mobile phones in a certain town, well, they have all the screws and all the gizmos you need to assemble those things. Vietnam does not have that ecosystem yet. And it also doesn't have enough skilled labor like China does. So the thing though that worries me, not so much is, there is the whole question that especially is being asked by Singaporeans is, will there be a bifurcation of the global economy? I think, based on what I said, I don't think the global economy and the supply chain per se will bifurcate, but there's a danger it might happen digitally. The Chinese produce a miserable amount. They're only like less than 10% of the semiconductors they need for all their technology, for artificial intelligence and all that stuff, 5G development. They buy roughly, they import 90% of it. About around 60% is imported from the United States, and a lot of the rest comes from Taiwan and South Korea. Well, guess whose friends those guys are? So it would be possible if the US really said we're going to turn the screws on China, on semiconductors, that could become a pretty big problem. Now, the mitigating factor is that some companies like Qualcomm are also very involved in selling this kind of technology to China, and it would destroy, besides destroying Huawei, it might also destroy some US companies. So I don't know, but that's the one area which could be really shaken up by what we see happening in tandem between COVID and the China-US trade war.
Yeah, I mean, inevitably the comparison with Russia also comes. I mean, we have seen how aggressive can Russia become in its own peripheries from the Georgian invasion last decade, and their election interference and electronic, warfare in some Eastern European countries. We saw some flavor of that in Taiwan recently. The Singaporeans have been raising some concerns about China's fifth column operations. How serious do you think is the possibility of China more aggressively using the sharp power, especially in countries with, more democratic countries like Philippines or Indonesia, right? Considering how important it is, the identity of the president is and how things could change vis-a-vis China on that issue. Should we really worried about this Chinese sharp power operations as we head towards our own elections here in the Philippines, among other countries?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I certainly think Taiwan is vulnerable after what we saw in Hong Kong. I'm not sure yet that they're you know, they've been, and they have been more involved in that in Australia and New Zealand, getting people elected who are going to then enter certain committees, foreign affairs committees that have jurisdiction over China policy. But that has really backfired on them big time, especially in Australia. Those relations are really, really troubled. Boy, if to try to do some of that in the Philippines and Indonesia, I don't know. We just really haven't. I know what Russia did, but I'm not sure that they're ready yet to try to do that. They have a friendly president in Indonesia. Jokowi, they irritate Jokowi regularly by mucking around, and they're doing it again, or almost as we speak, and in North Natuna, very similar to what they've done in Reed Bank and other places in the Philippines, and what they've done to the Vietnamese on fishing. But generally, Jokowi, although he's had sent his Coast Guard and jets to chase military jets to chase the Coast Guard away, has been quite friendly. And of course, you wouldn't want to muck around too much right now. Duterte, yes, he's very hard, has taken a hard hedge toward China in some ways, but I also think he is softening a little bit. He let these what do you call them? Those special. Oh, see now. What is the Armed Forces Agreement that it has with the United States called again?
Forces Agreement.
Yeah. So that agreement, he didn't terminate it. He's going to let it continue so that EDGA and some of those things can probably continue. But he seems to also be less critical recently of the United States. I don't quite know what that's about. Maybe he's going to let the elections happen. But it seems to me that he would be best off hedging between the two countries, seeing what you can get out of both of them. What I think part of his problem is that he went way over to the Chinese, so they figured, well, we've got you. You didn't even do anything. We didn't even do anything, and you gave us the candy store. So why bother? But if he hedged, he would have to. Both sides would have to give him a little bit more. I think that's sort of the role that several countries in the region play, including the Vietnamese to some extent.
Yeah. Now, of course, when it comes to China's influence in Southeast Asia, it's multidimensional, it's comprehensive. What are the strength areas and the weaknesses area when it comes to influence of China, and which areas do you think they'll have even more influence and pull in the coming decades and years? I mean, they're already a leading country when it comes to artificial intelligence. Alibaba is setting up a lot of, kind of e-commerce outlets in the region. Doesn't seem to be as much backlash against that. It's a little bit more complicated on 5G and Huawei, and definitely far more complicated on South China Sea territorial issues. So if you're gonna break down the matrix of China's influence, what are the strength areas and weaknesses areas, and by extension, what are the policy implications for the region and for America, for instance? What should the next administration do, whether it's a Trump 2.0 or the Biden administration?
Yeah. Well, I think you pointed to one area where China is much stronger than the US, and that's investing in the digital economy, e-commerce and artificial intelligence and all that stuff, and payment systems, Alipay and that stuff. It is very much more involved economically in terms of trade and those kinds of things. It is still quite weak in investment. Yeah. Infrastructure, it's got some things to learn before it's going to beat out the Japanese, for example. Everybody says we wish we could have had this thing built by the Japanese. Their interest rates. Because China, something that is not known for the most part is that the loans for Belt and Road come from the China Development Bank and Exim Bank, and they are money-making banks. They're not aid banks. The government expects them to make money, so they don't want to go below 4%. And the Japanese go to 0.7%, so it's much cheaper and much longer repayment periods. soft power, they're, in terms of like having people on the ground that get involved in education activities, like in Thailand, they have professors and involved in a lot of universities. Fulbright is basically gone. Peace Corps has pulled out of most of the world because of COVID. I imagine it'll come back. But on the other soft power stuff, like movies and music and the arts and that, I think people generally prefer non-Chinese stuff. Even, you know, in a lot of mainland Southeast Asia, Korean music is much more popular. K-pop and that kind of stuff's much more popular than anything China does. Although China's movies are pretty big in some countries, Thailand being one of them. But the way they're almost like the way Japanese used to be. They not infiltrate in a negative way, but just send people all over the place. And that's an amazing soft power that the US and Europe don't really do anymore, don't fund anymore. So you have individual academics or journalists that go off in the bush in various countries that, but no longer sponsored by big NGOs or the US government.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, I mean, we have to move to Justice Carpio next. Is there any advice that you have to give to the Philippines? It's something most people hate to give, but I mean, I'm sure this is what many people are anticipating from what you have gathered on the ground across the region. What do you think are the major lessons, especially for countries like in the Philippines that are definitely squeezed, both internally and also geopolitically?
Yeah. One of the biggest conclusions I came to is that ASEAN really is being courted by China bilaterally. All the Southeast Asian countries are being courted bilaterally by China and the United States. They both prefer to deal with the countries individually. It's much more complicated when you do it as a grouping. But if ASEAN would stand together, I think they could have a lot more clout. You know, for example, if Thailand and Laos had talked about their railroad, the Lao would have learned very early on that Thailand wasn't planning to build a railroad anytime soon. They would not have invested in this thing. If Malaysia had bothered to talk to the Thais and the Lao, they would have learned that that you can get interest rates far cheaper than Najib was negotiating, about half what Najib was negotiating. Myanmar needed help from ASEAN. They had to get it instead from, you know, the World Bank and others, some Americans from USAID who don't really know about the region and China that much, that could have benefited a lot from ASEAN giving them advice. Singapore should have been helping. And now, you know, you have Laos that had to give over its electricity distribution company last weekend to the Chinese because it can't pay its debts. It can't even renegotiate them. They're in such bad shape. I mean, really, that stuff should have been, the rest of ASEAN should have been involved in some of this stuff. And then I would also argue that if in the South China Sea, if there's got to be a way to get the whole of ASEAN to recognize why this is important and what would happen if China took it over. But in the meantime, I think it's amazing how little Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines talk to each other. And why don't those three countries with Brunei settle some of the disputed territories between them and get that off the table and show China what you can do? And I think the same would apply in the Mekong if there would be a united stand. I think China, yes, it can be really obstreperous, but it hates to be hated or have anger from everybody. Now they can split off the Cambodians or the Lao or Myanmar. Somebody's going to side with you. If everybody sided together, they would really hate that. They need Southeast Asia very badly for market endpoint for selling stuff. They need it for raw materials like coal and minerals from Indonesia. They need the food coming out of Thailand and all other places, Vietnam. They could. So if the ASEAN could work together, they could do a lot more than they're doing now. And I think what I'd tell the new administration, if it's Trump or it's Trump 2 or Biden, stay engaged, get back re-engaged with Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Murray, for that fantastic overview or synopsis of your book. I look forward to check it out, see if you have properly cited me or not. Thank you very much for that, Murray. And I'm sure
I have.
Yeah, folks can contact you for follow-up questions. I'll leave it to Dinda to transition to Justice Carpio. Thank you very much, Murray. Virtual claps for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Mary, for answering those questions raised by Richard. Allow me to move on to our program. We have one of the champions or advocate in protecting and preserving the Philippine territorial and maritime sovereignty for the past few years. So I'd like to ask one of our speakers, Justice Antonio Carpio, former Senior Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the Philippines, to discuss his views with regards to current geopolitical environment. Justice Carpio.
Thank you, Dindo. A good day to everyone. Let me congratulate Murray for his book. And he will be happy to know that in Manila, there is no problem downloading the Kindle version of the book, which I was able to do a few days ago. So let me go to the topic assigned to me by giving an overview of the South China Sea dispute. The South China Sea dispute has 3 dimensions. First, there is a territorial dispute between China and 4 ASEAN coastal states, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, over geologic features above water at high tide that are entitled to 12 nautical mile territorial seas. There is no tribunal that has jurisdiction over this territorial dispute unless the countries to the dispute voluntarily submit the dispute to arbitration. This is unlikely to happen because China has stated it will not submit to arbitration on territorial disputes. Like other territorial disputes in other parts of the world where the parties refuse to arbitrate, the territorial dispute in the South China Sea will go on and on and on for the next several decades. Fortunately, the geologic features involved in the dispute are tiny islands or rocks, barely above water at high tide. There is no urgency to resolve the territorial dispute. In any event, these tiny geologic features will most likely be submerged by sea level rise by the turn of the century and beyond. In that eventuality, the submerged geologic features will form part of the exclusive economic zone of the adjacent coastal state, and that happens to be the Philippines. Second, there is a maritime dispute over sovereign rights to the resources of waters enclosed by China's 9-dash line, which encroaches on the exclusive economic zones and extended continental shelves of 5 ASEAN coastal states, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. All the states to this maritime dispute are parties to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This maritime dispute was resolved in the South China Sea arbitration, where the arbitral tribunal ruled that China's 9-dash line cannot serve as legal basis to claim any of the waters or resources in the South China Sea. While technically the ruling applies only to the maritime dispute between the Philippines and China, it is expected that if arbitration cases are filed, the same ruling will be handed down in China's dispute with Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. There is urgency to resolve the maritime dispute because the exploitation of the oil and gas within the exclusive economic zones is vital for the economies of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. And third, there is the innocent passage and freedom of navigation and overflight dispute between China on one side and the US, UK, France, Australia, Japan, and Canada on the other side. China holds the view that in the territorial sea, innocent passage requires prior notice of the passage to China. And in the exclusive economic zone, naval and aerial exercises require the prior consent of China. The US and the other naval powers hold the opposite view. However, when Chinese naval vessels pass on innocent passage to the territorial seas of other coastal states, China does not give prior notice to the adjacent coastal states. When Chinese naval vessels conduct naval drills in the exclusive economic zones of other coastal states, China does not require prior consent from the adjacent coastal state. China does not secure prior consent from the adjacent coastal states. China practices a double standard. If China today declares that it will comply faithfully with UNCLOS, to which it is a party, and respects the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia in accordance with UNCLOS, then the South China Sea dispute will immediately vanish into thin air. All it takes for China and the 5 ASEAN coastal states to have peace is for China to comply with its obligation under UNCLOS. And if China today declares that it will practice in the South China Sea what it practices in the other seas of the world in terms of innocent passage and freedom of navigation and overflight, then there will be peace between China on one side and the US and its allies on the other side. But China refuses to respect the exclusive economic zones of the 5 ASEAN coastal states. China refuses to abandon its double standard on innocent passage and freedom of navigation and overflight. Why? China's clear objective in the South China Sea is to control the South China Sea for economic and military purposes, regardless of what UNCLOS and international law prescribe. China wants solely for itself all the economic resources within the 9-dash line, a maritime space amounting to about 85.7% of the South China Sea. China wants all the fish, oil, gas, and other mineral resources, including the islands, atolls, and reefs found within this huge maritime area. China will allow foreign warships and warplanes to sail or fly within this area merely to transit, but not to engage in military drills or activities. In short, the waters within the 9-dash line, beyond 12 nautical miles from China's coastlines, are like territorial waters of China, where all economic resources and geologic features belong to China, and where foreign warships and warplanes can only transit on innocent passage. China does not want to call this as territorial waters, but that is the effect of China's claim. Now, what is the effect of China's claim on other coastal states in the South China Sea? Vietnam will be almost landlocked, except for its territorial sea. Vietnam will lose almost its entire exclusive economic zone and extended continental shelf, except for the area near its border with Cambodia facing peninsular Malaysia. Vietnam will lose the entire parasols and its 21 geologic features it occupies in the Straits. Brunei will be landlocked, in fact, except for the territorial sea that it will retain. And it will lose almost all its exclusive economic zone and its entire extended continental shelf, including Louisa Reef, the sole geologic feature that Brunei claims in the Straits. The Philippines will lose almost all its exclusive economic zone and its entire extended continental shelf facing the South China Sea. The Philippines will lose the entire Reed Bank, the largest gas field of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. Malaysia will lose almost all its exclusive economic zone and its entire extended continental shelf from Borneo facing the South China Sea. Malaysia will also lose its 5 geologic features that it occupies in the Straits. Indonesia will lose all its exclusive economic zone in the North Natuna Islands facing the South China Sea. The effect of China's claim on Philippine territory is sweeping. The Philippines will lose the entire Calayan Island group, the Straits, where the Philippines occupies 9 geologic features. The Philippines will lose Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines will lose a maritime area larger than its total land area. The 9-dash line will become China's national boundary in the South China Sea. The Philippines and China will become very close neighbors, with China's 9-dash line boundary just 64 kilometers from Balabac Island, the southernmost island of the Philippines facing the South China Sea, 70 kilometers from the coast of Bolinao town in Pangasinan, and 44 kilometers from Yami Island, the northernmost island of the Philippines in the Batanes. The Philippines and China will be separated by just a narrow strip of water that constitutes the territorial sea and the much shrunken exclusive economic zone of the Philippines facing the South China Sea. If China succeeds in seizing the exclusive economic zones of the 5 ASEAN coastal states, thus making the South China Sea China's own proprietary lake, then UNCLOS will collapse and will cease to be the constitution for the oceans and seas of our planet. China's fishing fleet, the largest in the world, and enjoying state subsidy, will roam the vast seas which are presently the exclusive economic zones of coastal states. China will start extracting oil and gas in waters that are presently the exclusive economic zones of ASEAN coastal states. China's fishing fleet and drilling platforms will enjoy the protection of China's powerful navy, now the largest navy in the world in terms of number of ships. There will be an expensive naval arms race as coastal states acquire warships, warplanes, and missiles to protect their maritime zones. There will be instability and skirmishes in the oceans and seas. This is where China's aggressive action in the South China Sea is leading the world to a dangerous and volatile place for all the peoples of the world should China succeed in making the South China Sea its own lake. That is why it is vitally important for world peace that the South China Sea dispute be resolved in accordance with international law, and in particular, UNCLOS. I will end my short remarks here. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Justice Carpio. Always insightful on your views with regards to issues confronting the Philippines, especially in the West Philippine Sea, and now from a regional context. For our next speaker, we have invited to discuss what she called in one of my conversations with her, crimes, understanding Chinese crimes in South China Sea. Allow me to introduce Justice Conchita Carpio Morales, a former ombudsman and a former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the Philippines. I remember in 2018, Justice Morales released a statement after President Duterte signed multiple partially undisclosed deals with Chinese President Xi Jinping, including an oil exploration deal which violates the Constitution and gives leeway to China's claims in the West Philippine Sea. So Justice Conchita, can I give you the floor now?
Thank you, Dindo. Ladies and gentlemen. Oh, yeah.
Yes, we can hear you, ma'am.
Sorry. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the privilege to speak before you in this forum as we try to understand the emerging challenges posed by China's expansionism in the world and particularly in the Southeast Asian region. I'd like to congratulate Mr. Murray Hybert for his nuanced analysis of the diverse approaches of Southeast Asian countries to China's expansionism. As discussed by Mr. Hybert, a country's assessment of its international relations would involve a balancing of threats and opportunities. And while certain countries have gained some benefits from Chinese expansionism, I dare say that its overall effect on the world has not been for the better, but for the worse. Over the years, we have seen that Chinese expansionism comes at a great cost to humanity as a whole and our rule-based international order. The Chinese government is all over the news in its relentless disregard of human rights and violation of the territorial integrity of the states and the law of the sea. I do not think that these continuing atrocities can be fully compensated by China's monetary favors to other countries. In our own backyard, we see China's invasion of almost the entirety of the South China Sea, taking from Filipinos, as well as our neighbors in the region, the land and waters clearly belonging to them by heritage and under international law. In pushing for its legally and historically preposterous claim in the South China Sea, the Chinese government is taking away almost all the entirety of the West Philippine Sea, an area larger than the total land area of the Philippines, including all the food, oil, and gas in the area belonging to present and future generations of Filipinos. In doing so, Chinese officials and agents have committed inhumane acts that constitute crimes against humanity as defined by the Rome Statute for destroying the marine wealth and food security of the people living in the countries bordering the South China Sea. Just these past few months, we have seen countries like the US, some European and Asian states already taking a firm stance against the hostile actions led by the ruling Chinese Communist Party. We Filipinos should also unite against Chinese incursions upon our national heritage, the West Philippine Sea. While the Duterte administration remains unwilling to confront China's crimes against the Filipinos, we are not entirely helpless in seeking ways to speak and act against the criminal actions of the Chinese government. As earlier mentioned by Ambassador Albert Del Rosario, he and I submitted a communication to the International Criminal Court, or ICC, Office of the Prosecutor, to show that Chinese President Xi Jinping, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and former Chinese Ambassador Zhao Jinhua, among others, committed crimes against humanity by, among others, illegally blockading the traditional fishing grounds like the waters around Scarborough Shoal and causing the near permanent destruction of the marine environment of the South China Sea. I believe that this ICC case is complementary to and builds upon the award in the South China Sea arbitration issued by under the 1982 United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Our ICC case enforces the criminal aspect of the UNCLOS award by seeking to hold liable the individuals responsible for the crimes committed in the South China Sea and which were already found unlawful by the UNCLOS tribunal. As mentioned again by Ambassador Rosario, we submitted on September 16 or 15 rather, our response which addressed the jurisdictional concerns of the ICC Office of the Prosecutor. In our response, we addressed the issue of territoriality, which is a basic principle of criminal law. We demonstrated that the crimes against humanity committed by President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials and agents occurred not only in the in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, but also in its territorial sea and the coast of Luzon. The Philippine territorial sea and the coast of Luzon are part of the territory of our country for purposes of ICC jurisdiction. To enable us further to understand the ICC case, which the ambassador and I initiated, please allow me to answer 7 possible basic questions, which I think are foremost in the minds of the public. Question number 1, what is the subject of the communication dated March 13, which was filed with the ICC? The answer is, as stated by Ambassador Rosario, it describes how Chinese President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials committed crimes against humanity by intentionally depriving Filipinos and other coastal inhabitants in the South China Sea of the food and livelihood. Until now, Chinese officials continue to commit the crimes. Question number 2, what are the jurisdictional concerns on the communication raised by the ICC Office of the Prosecutor as published in the 2019 report on preliminary examination? Answer. The ICC Office of the Prosecutor stated that for the ICC to take jurisdiction, the crimes alleged in the communication should occur in the territory of the Philippines, which includes its landmass, internal waters, territorial sea, and the airspace above such areas. The ICC Office of the Prosecutor believed that the conduct alleged in the communication may have occurred in the EZZ of the Philippines, which is strictly not territory for purposes of criminal jurisdiction of the ICC. Given this, the ICC Office of the Prosecutor nevertheless stated that its decision may be reconsidered, that's the word of the ICC, in the light of new facts or information. Thus, if it's shown that the conduct subject of the communication occurred in the Philippine landmass, internal waters, territorial sea, and airspace above such areas, the ICC has basis to proceed with the communication. Question number 3. What is the response of Ambassador Del Rosario and yours truly to the jurisdictional concerns raised by the ICC Office of the Prosecutor? Answer. Our response submitted this week demonstrated that the crimes of humanity committed by President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials occurred not only in the EEZ of the Philippines, but also in its territory, especially in the territorial sea. The crimes consist of A. Destructive island building in Subi Reef, part of the illegal destructive reclamation and artificial island building undertaken by Chinese officials in this pratley occurred in Subi Reef, which is within the territorial sea of Pag-asa, international code name C2. Pag-asa is Philippine territory with a permanent community of Filipinos and is controlled and administered by the Philippines. B2 rather. Blockade in Scarborough Shoal. Chinese officials continue to enforce its hostile blockade within the territorial sea of Scarborough Shoal that prevents Filipino fishermen from pursuing their livelihood. These fishermen live along the coast of Luzon. The effects of these criminal actions by the Chinese therefore extend to the coast of Luzon. Swarming in Pag-asa. The swarming actions of at least 322 Chinese militia vessels in Pag-asa shores for more than 600 days since 2018 meant to intimidate Filipinos, harass those Filipinos living in Pag-asa, and prevent fishermen from pursuing their livelihood. These Chinese militia vessels illegally remain in the area indefinitely. Ramming of FV Genver. The June 2019 ramming of FV Genver occurred in Reed Bank, where 22 Filipino fishermen aboard were left to die until they were rescued by a Vietnam fishing vessel and ultimately recovered by the Philippine Navy. While this occurred in the Philippine EEZ, this falls within the ICC jurisdiction because the Chinese crime was committed against a Philippine registered vessel. Question number 4. What other information was submitted in your response to the ICC Office of the Prosecutor? Answer. We also pleaded in our response senior executives of China Communications Construction Company, given the confirmation that CCC and its subsidiary undertook the destructive reclamation and artificial island building in the South China Sea, resulting in the immediate and long-term food and livelihood deprivation of Filipinos and other coastal inhabitants of the South China Sea. This is the same CCC involved in the Sangley Point International Airport project of the Philippine government in Cavite. Question number 5. Was in this case dismissed by the ICC Office of the Prosecutor? Answer, no. This is a continuing case. The ICC Office of the Prosecutor informed us that this case is, quote unquote, maintained in the ICC and its jurisdictional concerns, quote again, may be reconsidered in the light of new facts and information, unquote. It is in light of this statement by the ICC Office of the Prosecutor that on December 13, 2019, we responded to the ICC that we intended to submit a more extensive discussion why the acts of the Chinese officials occurred within the territorial jurisdiction of the ICC, consistent with Article 12, 2A of the Rome Statute, as well as to give new facts and information to supplement our communication. Question number 6 rather. Isn't this affected by the withdrawal by the Philippines from the Rome Statute? Our answer is, we submitted our communication to the ICC Office of the Prosecutor on March 13 before the effectivity of the Philippine withdrawal from the ICC statute on March 17, 2019. Under the ICC statute, the ICC retains jurisdiction over crimes committed by Chinese President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials in Philippine territory during the period when the Philippines was a party to the Rome Statute, that is November 1, 2011 until March 17, 2019. Given the continuing nature of Chinese crimes in the South China Sea, the ICC retains jurisdiction over these crimes, including acts committed or being committed after the effectivity of the Philippine withdrawal from the Rome Statute. The last question, question number 7. What is the purpose of pursuing the case in the ICC? Through our own private efforts, we are pursuing this case in the ICC to demand accountability from China on behalf of the aggrieved people on account of China's seizure of our lands and waters, harassment of our soldiers, ramming of our fishermen, and the near permanent destruction of our marine environment in the West Philippine Sea. The University of the Philippines Marine Institute conservatively estimated that our country is at least losing 33.1 billion annually from our damaged reef ecosystems due to China's reclamation activities and illegal fishing operations. This sums up to more than 231.17 billion since the start of 2014, around the time China started dredging until the present. Until this year, China continues to commit crimes against Filipinos. We have not obtained any redress from China. Filipinos support our efforts to hold Chinese President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials criminally accountable for their illegal actions in the South China Sea, because this is a fight for the Philippines, a country all of us love. We hope in earnest that our government and more of our countrymen join us in this quest for justice for the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Conchita. Always brave and strong words, and happy to have you advocating these things for the Filipino people in defending our maritime rights and territorial integrity.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Allow me to proceed to our next speaker, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Strat-based Albert Rosario Institute. Dr. Renato De Castro just recently published with the Institute a special study entitled The Challenge of Managing 21st Century Pandemics Amidst the US-China Strategic Competition. You can even download it from our website at the Albert Rosario Institute. I turn it over now to Dr. Rene to discuss the US-China strategic competition amidst the pandemic. Dr. Rene?
Good morning. Good morning.
Yes.
For those who are in the Philippines, good morning. For those who are in the United States, good evening. I have a PowerPoint presentation. So my presentation would focus on the larger picture. My friend Murray mentioned basically one shadow, the shadow of the eagle. My presentation would focus on the other shadow, which is of course not, the dragon, but a real animal, the eagle, the United States, and looking at what's happening in the context of two shadows, the shadow of a mythical animal, the dragon, and of course the shadow of a real animal, the eagle. So let me start my presentation by, looking at the context of the strategic rivalry. So I would start with the declaration of then President Barack Obama in 2011 that there'll be a rebalancing, or what was then the term used by President Barack Obama then was a pivot to Asia, but later on it was of course changed into rebalancing, looking at East Asia as the focus of American strategic attention and focus. So rebalancing was in a way a grand strategy envisioned to use basically American military power to impress upon China that it would have to take into account American military power as it exercises its efforts to expand in the South China Sea and to other parts of the first island chain, including the East China Sea. So focusing on Southeast Asia and without pressing other commitments in other parts of the world during that time, the intention then, the goal then was of course, make China take into account American naval power that is of course being transferred from other parts of the world into East Asia, specifically of course, into the South China Sea. So you have of course a change in administration in 2016. You have President Donald Trump who initially said, I will not adopt the rebalancing strategy, but in a way he simply reworked on the Obama administration rebalancing strategy by moving away from the notion that China could be a responsible stakeholder, and basically seeing it China as a strategic competitor who could not be trusted to be a responsible stakeholder in the region, and of course in the process abandon any delusion of power sharing with China, which has been the core of US foreign policy vis-a-vis China since the time of President Nixon. So the goal, then of course you have the declaration to maintain US primacy in the Indo-Pacific region. The Trump administration saw no need anymore to integrate China. China's competitor. China threatens the order. So we have to compete with China. So again, this is I mentioned earlier, moving away from the old notion of accommodation and engagement, which the Trump administration basically considered a failure. So you have, of course, the Trump administration policy of engaging China. Of course, when it began, it was strategic competition. Later on, right now, of course, in the context of the pandemic, it's now strategic confrontation. I won't go into the details of the strategy of the pre and open Pacific. It was, of course, the details of the strategy was discussed by then Secretary Mattis when he said in the Shangri-La Dialogue, America is an Indo-Pacific region. It's in the Indo-Pacific region. It's our this is our chapter of operation. Interest, of course, is linked with the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, there's also an announcement of what is the policy of the Trump administration vis-a-vis China. And that's a notion of principled realism, which involves cooperating with China when it's necessary, but of course, being very vocal, very open in criticizing Chinese behavior, more importantly and more specifically in the South China Sea. I'll just breeze through this. So my discussion would focus on the ongoing strategic competition and how the 10 Southeast Asian countries under, of course, the rubric of ASEAN is trying to get out of this strategic, being under the shadows of these two animals, the dragon versus the eagle. So you have, of course, heightened tension in US-China overall relations. Murray mentioned about trade. You have, of course, also in terms of technology, but more importantly, for us who are here in this region, is the intense competition in 4 geostrategic flashpoints. Taiwan Straits, East China Sea, Korean Peninsula, and of course our concern is the South China Sea. For the United States, the South China Sea disputes present the United States with a clear-cut strategic challenge. Chinese military expansion is a threat to US strategic interests. I will not go into detail. Of course, you have threatening the US Navy's operation in the South China Sea, growing naval capability that could threaten American firms and consumers, possibility of Chinese blockade, and of course, threat to American allies, like of course, the Philippines. Of course, beyond the heightened tension in the disputed waters, the intensifying strategic competition between China and the United States on the one hand, and even of course, China and Japan on the other hand, have complicated the South China Sea dispute. Now, what is happening is that we have, the competition or the confrontation has created what we call a strategic impasse, a stalemate, a classic Mexican standoff, wherein, of course, what Mao would say, a single spark could start a fiery fire, triggered a major, not only competition or confrontation, but the possibility, of course, of an armed conflict. So I'll discuss basically how the 10 member states of ASEAN are trying to find their way out of this strategic competition, find their way out of the shadows of the dragon and the eagle. So I'll be giving a short discussion on the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So what is the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific? The ASEAN countries try to address the quintessential security challenge here in the Indo-Pacific region, and that is, of course, the US-China strategic competition. So during the 34th ASEAN Summit in Bangkok, the 10 ASEAN member states adopted the Indonesian-sponsored, but of course, as in the cases of ASEAN, non-binding ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The ASEAN adopted the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific as a common outlook, not a strategy. It's just how they would perceive the developments. Agree on a direction for region in the light of course, rising uncertainty. Again, it's just a 5-page document, but it never mentioned the reason why the ASEAN adopted that document. And that is, of course, the US-China strategic confrontation. So Indonesia formulated the ASEAN-centered Indo-Pacific strategy. In a way, it's a reaction to the US, United States free and open Indo-Pacific, which Indonesia perceived as a threat to ASEAN centrality. And of course, also in a way, an effort to isolate and possibly the term, adopting the Chinese term, containing China. Indonesia is very suspicious of the quadrilateral security dialogue. So the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific stresses ASEAN centrality and strength, of course, in the light of the Quad, and of course, the fact that the Quad is here in a way to watch over China. Now, I won't use the term contain, but in a way, engage China in the strategic competition. The 5-page document broadly outlines the regional organization vision. Never mention about strategy, diplomacy. It's more on connectivity, speed up maritime cooperation, guide development, so forth and so on. Renunciation, the threat of use of force. Many analysts describe this as a cautious, muted underwhelming in the face of the fact that you have a strategic uncertainty generated by the raging US-China strategic confrontation. And given that the document focused on economics and development issues, it offers a little in mitigating the rising uncertainty in the ASEAN in the wider strategic context. So in a way, the document acknowledges that you have dramatic changes going on, but of course, it refuses to recognize or address the following issue. Deal squarely with the South China Sea dispute. Of course, address China's maritime expansion in Southeast Asia, enable the ASEAN member states to respect international law, and of course, what it will do to manage or mitigate the elephant in the room for ASEAN. That is, of course, US-China strategic competition. And of course, what happened, it's not even a strategy. It's just a common outlook. And those who basically rationalize or justifies this outlook simply say, at least it's providing ASEAN member states a reference point, a map, a roadmap to engage other countries while ensuring that ASEAN rules and principles are upheld. It will act as a lens of which ASEAN principles can be viewed. So this is just my conclusion. So amidst the US-China strategic competition, those countries that Murray mentioned are under the shadow of Beijing and Washington are trying to come out with an effort for a common strategy. Of course, they failed. Instead, it adopted a watered-down Indonesian-sponsored regional outlook that ignores the fact, the elephant in the room, the great power competition or confrontation, and overlooks the fact that each ASEAN member state, and this, of course, why ASEAN never came out with a common strategy. Each ASEAN member state has its own strategy vis-a-vis China, and I think this is discussed in detail by Murray's book. I'm looking forward to having a copy of my book. I can make you a more comprehensive review of that book if you have a free copy, of course. ASEAN states can play a substantive regional role only, of course, if you have cooperation among the regional states. This cooperation demands that they accept, all great powers accept a status quo, or at least believe in the importance of peaceful change in the Indo-Pacific. However, of course, the reality is not the case. China, of course, is an emerging great power. It has expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And of course, you have the ongoing US-China geopolitical confrontation that, of course, testing ASEAN's limits as a regional organization. And this is my last strike. Of course, the reality is we have competition, which is, of course, a reflection of the fact you have strain and, of course, competitive relations among the great powers. China on the one hand, Japan, the United States, India, Australia, as Quad on the other, that, of course, forcing, in a way, ASEAN to take side. Recently, of course, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in his message to ASEAN, is trying to ask ASEAN to take a side by taking, adopting Chinese position that the stabilizing power here is the United States. If the ASEAN member states would agree to this, then of course you have the end of ASEAN. That will mean division of ASEAN. And what's basically happening, and I think this is mentioned by Murray in his book, is the fact that the ASEAN is simply paralyzed. I have adopted a form of passive neutrality in the face of this ongoing strategic confrontation. This is my last presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rene. Thank you, Dr. Rene.
Yes.
I think we will allow questions to be asked. I turn it over to my colleague Richard.
Maraming salamat, Dindo, and thank you very much for the great panel. We have until I think 11:30 to raise issues. Some questions are coming in. Right off the bat, perhaps this question goes to all of the speakers. You may answer it whichever way you want. I mean, how do we make sense of the recent decisions of the Duterte administration? I mean, next to Hun Sen, he's seen as the most pro-China leader, at least that's the perception, and yet we have seen the reversal on the visiting forces agreement. We have seen the release of Mr. Pemberton, a convicted murderer. We have seen top officials in the Philippine government, the defense minister, the foreign secretary openly criticizing China or calling for China to abide by international law and supporting Pompeo's latest statements on the South China Sea. How do we make sense out of that? Is this about reassertion of Philippine interests? Is it about so-called pro-American elements in the government winning the day? Or is it Duterte making some recalibration because he didn't get any major concessions from China? How do we make sense out of that? I mean, Justice Carpio, do you have maybe Dr. De Castro, Justice Carpio, and Justice Conchita? How do we make sense of the recent decision of President Duterte on VFA, on Pemberton, on tough statements coming from Locsin and from Lorenzana, among others? I mean, what's going on here? How do you see it?
Justice Carpio first.
Well, I think it shows that there is no coherent foreign policy at all. It's knee-jerk foreign policy. Like the Pemberton case, he said he believed that Pemberton should be credited with good conduct because there was no record keeping by the jailers. Well, he could have just commuted the sentence without giving full pardon, because full pardon means there was the penalty was completely extinguished, and it's not fair to the victims and the Filipino people because a crime has been committed. If you just wanted to release him right now, he could have done it by just commuting the sentence, by giving a conditional pardon, because a conditional pardon will not extinguish the penalty. The penalty remains. For the record, he was penalized. But right now, because he was given an absolute pardon, it is as if he has been restored to all his civil and political rights. I mean, if you were a Filipino, all his civil and political rights would be restored because that's the effect of a full pardon. For example, in the VFA, when he suspended the running of the period to terminate the VFA, I mean, he just did it like that. I mean, it's you advance and then you retreat, advance and you retreat. There's really no coherent policy. He said that he doesn't want to go to war with China. Well, nobody wants to go to war with China. And that's against the Constitution, that's against international law. There is really a total absence of coherence in our foreign policy with respect to the South China Sea. Thank you.
Justice Carpio, is erratic better than pro-China? Isn't it better that he's inconsistent rather than consistently, I mean, siding with one power that is going against our national interests?
Well, unfortunately, he's erratic in favor of China most of the time. So, but I think for the long term, we must have a coherent policy because we're squandering the victory of the arbitral ruling. The Hague and time marches on. China continues to solidify its air and naval bases in the Spratlys, and it takes a whole-of-nation approach to counter China, and we have to coordinate our strategy with the strategy of Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, and with our allies, the U.S. and the allies of the U.S. We cannot do this all by ourselves.
Thank you very much. Justice Carpio Morales, do you have, what's your take on Duterte's latest decision, both as a legal expert and, you know, a Filipino citizen?
Let me take exception to your legal expert reference to me, but your guess is as good as mine. But maybe, just maybe, he has reason to ingratiate himself to the United States. Or there could be a reason to have a quid pro quo with the US, and that's the reason why he readily extended pardon to Pemberton. But whatever it is, I know that the majority of the Filipinos do not like the grant of pardon by the president to Pemberton. And that also silenced the presidential spokesman. Before the pardon, he was furious because the judge in Olongapo granted the release of Pemberton, but after the president granted pardon to him, he was silenced forever.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Dr. De Castro?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Justice Carpio that there's no grand design. There's no, clear-cut foreign policy. So what's happening, it's reacting to both external and internal developments. There are two major external developments that happened. This was mentioned by Murray, the fact that he opened the candy store without getting anything from China. So that is about the Chinese promise of $24 billion. What he got was just about $165 million for the Kaliwa Dam. Plus, of course, continuing Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. I'll just mention one that basically caused concern to both the Department of Foreign Affairs and Defense, the February 17th, when you have a Chinese corvette pointing its gun control system at the BRP Conrado Yap. So this was very alarming especially for the military and of course the Department of Defense. Internally, of course, you have the active lobbying of two departments that are very much concerned with what China is doing. And of course, right now, they're acting in unison. I'm talking about the Department of Foreign Affairs under Secretary Locsin and of course the Department of National Defense. So they, in a way, they created a a coalition that is basically pushing this government to take a harder approach vis-a-vis China. So this is how I look at. I have no disagreement with Justice Carpio. It's the fact that it has no coherent policy. That's why it's subject to both external and internal pressures. And of course, what's also happened, and I find it very interesting, was the fact that it was last August when, for the first time, a ranking official of the Duterte administration, Secretary Locsin, admitted that the alliance is important to the Philippines. Remember this? When he was being interviewed in ANC, when he was asked, what would you do if a Chinese ship attacks a Filipino vessel? He said, I'll call Washington, D.C. the first time. So, as an analyst, as an academic, this is something that you look at those changes. I don't know that will have impact on the long term, but these are indication that I'm seeing a shift in this country's foreign policy. It might be chaotic, but at least it's not pro-China. I tend to agree with you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Castro. There's also a specific question for you, and I'll try to build on that. You mentioned passive neutrality of ASEAN and the, not necessarily optimal nature of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. What do you think is the ideal or preferable and probably realistic way that the ASEAN should respond to the China challenge?
Again, that's possible, yeah, because ASEAN is weak. It could not even, all decisions that ASEAN will have to be made will always be based on unanimity. Plus, of course, ASEAN has no machinery whatsoever. We only have a very small secretariat. Every year, you have the standing committee or chairmanship being transferred from one ASEAN country to another. So there's simply no continuity. ASEAN, in a way, is subject to drift. And what's, of course, happening is the fact that this drift is reflected by the fact that it's adopted a policy of passive neutrality. I don't know how it will react to the speech by Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in a way asking ASEAN to take a position by, adopting Chinese position to see the United States as the major destabilizer in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much for.
Thanks, Dr. De Castro. To Justice Carpio and Carpio Morales, why should we value international law? Does it even matter when it comes to dealing with the South China Sea? Because President Duterte and his supporters keep on saying that no one can enforce arbitration award anywhere. You're going to send an aircraft carrier. What's the point here? It doesn't give us any leverage. Why do you still believe in that? And in relation to that, recently Secretary Locsin turned down the proposal to take the case to the United Nations General Assembly. Why do you think it's important that we look at all international fora, including the United Nations General Assembly? I think Justice Carpio had a column on Inquirer also on this specific issue, if I'm not mistaken. Could you tell us why international law matters, why the United Nations still matters, and what is our evidence to suggest that it actually influences China's actions in a desirable way?
Well, first of all, Richard, we have no choice but to follow international law because the Constitution says we renounce war as an instrument of national policy. And under the UN Charter, you cannot resort to war to settle a dispute. You have to go to mediation and arbitration, negotiation, mediation, and arbitration. And that's what we've done. And because we've done that, we won. And it's crazy to go to war because we will surely lose. We have to bring the dispute to a forum where there's a level playing field. And in an UNCLOS tribunal or in a International Court of Justice, there is a level playing field because the judges will not care whether you are a nuclear armed power or not, whether you have aircraft carriers or missiles. They will just look at the law. And that's why we won at The Hague, because the decision was based on law. And that's why we have to use the law, because that is our strength. And it's crazy to go to war. We cannot win any war against China. That's why it's important. And there are 5 decisions of international tribunals against nuclear armed states. And 4 of those nuclear armed states eventually comply with the decision of the International Tribunal. It's only China that has refused to comply. But I'm not looking at it between July 2016 and today. I'm looking at compliance in the next 10, 20, 30 years. This is a long-term game. China, I think we, in the end, will comply if the world will support us. If the United Nations General Assembly will vote as one and say, China, you have to comply, in the same way that the UN General Assembly told the US in the Nicaragua case.
Mhm.
Only two countries sided with the US and Israel. The rest of the world voted against the US or abstained. We have to bring the South China dispute to that stage where the world will tell China, you have to comply with international law. And that's how you had to strike a compromise with China is through the use of true international law, because there's no way we can win against China through war, because we're not a nuclear armed state. And that's why we have to rely on international law. And it has been shown, Bangladesh won against India, a nuclear armed power, and India complied. Mauritius won against the UK, a nuclear armed power, and the UK complied. Nicaragua won against the US, a nuclear armed power. The US eventually complied.
Mm.
So we should look at it at a very long perspective.
Right.
This is just phase one. And this is what I call an intergenerational struggle. We have laid the foundation. The foundation is that arbiter ruling, and we have to build on that. Thank you.
Justice Carpio, I mean, how do you feel about the fact that, I mean, some would say that China is not using the word 9-line anymore much since the arbitration came out? Maybe that's a sign that this is having some effect on China because they were so embarrassed by the decision. And the fact that you have Malaysia last December making a submission to United Nations, you know, extended continental shelf, invoking the Philippines claims. Indonesia also had a nota verbale, I think late April. United States also made a nota verbale in early June. So we're finally seeing, after maybe a little bit too, not hopefully too late, but 3 or 4 years later on, more and more countries are invoking the Philippine Arbitration Award. And Secretary Pompeo actually explicitly mentioned that. Are these encouraging signs that China is being put under pressure and that other countries are finally seeing the point of what we were doing a few years ago when they were not showing as much support, including our Vietnamese friends back then?
Yes, I think that eventually the world will understand the core issue here. That China's 9-line is just a figment of the imagination of China. It's totally false. It's the fake history of the millennium. The world will finally understand that, and that is our task, to educate the world. And we have already the ruling. So we have a very strong base from which to educate the world. And I think we are gaining, because even China is trying to find a way to get away from the 9-line. They floated the 4 shas that they are claiming the same area based on the 4 archipelagos, the Nansha, the Spratleys, you have the Paracels, you have Dongsha, you have the Zhongsha, the Macclesfield Bank. But of course, that won't fly also, because that's been decided already by the arbitral tribunal that you cannot. These are not archipelagos in the real sense. China cannot claim exclusive economic zones from these areas. So I think the truth is on our side. History is on our side. The law is on our side. Let's use those to educate the world, and so that China will eventually comply. I am not sold to the idea that China will not comply. It will take time. The US did not comply right away. The US fought. And
Staggered compliance in that sense, kind of like a staggered.
Yes, they will use a way to satisfy us, but without humiliating themselves. Like the US said, we cannot pay you damages, but we can give you economic aid. So there will be a solution to this if we stand firm, if we get the world to support us. Thank you.
Thank you. Justice Carpio Morales, you know, despite the decision on your communications to the ICC, I mean, you continue to believe in international instruments, and why do you think it's important for the Filipino people to see the point in using international law and international instruments to fight for our territorial and maritime rights? I think naka-silence po kayo. Just, yeah. Ayan, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Given the fact that the International Tribunal does not have an implementing arm, it's just logical that we have to enforce our rights. And that's the reason why initially Justice Carpio was suggesting to the international community to consider our plight and to understand why we should have the ruling enforced, because otherwise we will be subject of laughing stock if we do not assert our rights and have the decision implemented. Now, we believe that we are the subject of continuing torture by the Chinese, because the activities they have started, the illegal activities they have started, continue to this date. And so we thought that we have to avail of international law to have our rights vindicated by filing this communication to the ICC Office of the Prosecutor. And as I mentioned earlier, fortunately, contrary to the understanding of some, the communication or complaint was not dismissed, because the ICC itself, Office of the Prosecutor, said that the complaint is maintained pending the possible submission of new facts or explanation to justify why it should be maintained.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. On a final note, before we close this question and answer portion, maybe each of these panelists could respond to it, and we maybe go in the reverse order with Carpio Morales. What do you think should the Philippine government do, not only as Duterte enters his final year in office, but the next administration? What should we do? Why it's not too late? What can we do to make sure that we protect our interests in the best way possible? What is your take on that, Justice?
You're saying to?
Yeah, yes. Now,
to me?
Yes, each of you panelists.
Well, yes. You know, there is no prescription in the enforcement of the arbitral ruling that we got from the arbitral tribunal. So we expect the Philippine government to support us, to change its attitude in not interested in having the judgment implemented, because it is for the benefit of the present present generation and future generations of Filipinos. Now, if we cannot convince the government to support us, we hope that the next administration will, as contrasted to the present policy of the government, will support us and help us have the arbitral ruling implemented. And in the case of the criminal aspect, so that the government can support us towards the success of the desired investigation and, if possible, prosecution of President Xi Jinping and his ilk.
Is there anything that Ombudsman Carpio Morales, is there anything that this administration had got right? I mean, some would point out to efforts by Secretary Lorenzana to strengthen our position on the ground, you know, repairing our airstrip, you know, things that we have not done in the past. Is there anything good that has come out of the administration? Because people are going to say we're just criticizing here, but have there?
Well,
yeah.
You know, sometimes you think that they are already firm in their policies, but the next day they vary their policies. So we cannot really guess when and how they will ever be firm in their commitment to help us, or just to please somebody, or just to please China. We can never guess what the policy they really want to adopt insofar as the issues with China are concerned.
Too erratic.
But they cannot always be wrong. They cannot always be wrong also. Sometimes they are also right.
Thank you for Dr. De Castro. What about you? What is your take on this?
I think it's, you know, the rhetoric of being independent foreign policy. I think the next administration should really make an independent foreign policy. Independent is a way that you make the decision on the basis that you interact with, you know, great powers. You are not, you know, trying to move away from one great power, then becoming dependent on another, being under the shadow of a more dangerous great power, which is bent, of course, on maritime expansion, and of course, your neighbor. So it had to be a more balanced, really independent foreign policy that would, of course, be based on your national interests, taking into account that you have a very powerful strategic ally and you have security partners, and being open to economic opportunities, but from China, but also being careful in dealing with China because you have a territorial dispute with China. So I think that's
sorry, Moray is making a follow-up also. I mean, since he's
short.
one of,
I think he should have the last word.
no.
Yeah,
I mean,
Murray
he's
should
asking a
always.
question here, and
Okay.
you know, he's our special guest.
Okay, let's give him the last word.
What do you think, Dr. De Castro, when it comes to the Chinese BRI investments? I mean, is there something good we can get out of it? How can we get the best out of China while keeping its worst instinct in check? Is there a way to do that?
I think China first should reform on how it provides ODA. Like, of course, the standard Chinese approach is that they'll bring everything. Like the laborer, all materials. So it's just basically relieving China of its surplus steel and labor. So it should adopt the OECD standard, you know, providing you untied assistance, and then you pick your other partners. This is a point raised by then Secretary Pernia of the National Economic Development Authority. You know, the reason why we did not get a lot of, you know, the Duterte administration did not get money to support its Build program is because the Chinese approach is different from the Korean, the Japanese, and the Americans, who basically provide you ODA untied loans. Unlike in the case of the Chinese, everything will have to come from China. I think that's the best way we could take advantage of the BRI if China would reform its Belt and Road Initiative. Okay,
so
thank you very much.
Reformulations. Thank you very much, Dr. De Castro. So for the last but not the least words from Justice Carpio, what is the best way forward? What should the next administration do and Duterte do in his final stretch in office to protect our interests and avoid further damage to our interests?
Well, after the Duterte administration, the next administration should proceed to go to the UN General Assembly to get the support of the world community. We should settle our overlapping EEZ and extended continental shelf claim with Malaysia and Vietnam. These are very doable. We don't really have a dispute with them because all you need is to go to the median line that's provided for under UNCLOS. And we all agree with the Vietnam and Malaysia that there are no exclusive economic zones that can be generated from the Spratlys. So there is no really dispute between Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines with respect to the maritime issue, which is different from the territorial issue. We should file our extended continental shelf claim in the South China Sea. Malaysia filed just last December. But we are not filing because the Duterte administration is afraid to offend China. But why should we be afraid to offend China? It is our right. We have to protect our national interest. We must file. And if you file, you're actually enforcing the ruling because you file an extended continental shelf beyond your EEZ. You assume you have an EEZ. And we have that EEZ because there is the ruling already. All of these actions fortify the ruling because they are state practices that enforce the ruling. We can enter into a convention with the rest of the naval powers of the world that in the South China Sea, there are no exclusive economic zones from the Spratlys, so they can exercise freedom of navigation and our flight beyond the territorial seas. And that will be enforcing the ruling. So there are many ways of enforcing the ruling through the rule of law. And we build on the arbitral ruling, fortify it by state practice, and that's how we can win this battle. But the Duterte administration has done nothing of this, so the next administration must do this. Thank you.
On that note, thank you very much to our panelists, Dr. De Castro, Justice Carpio, and former Ombudswoman Carpio Morales, and I'll pass it down to Dindo.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you to the commentaries and actions and the reactions of our esteemed guests. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mary for not only presenting his book, but also for answering questions from Richard. So I took note of some insights. Hopefully I can share it to everyone. You know, when I was listening to Murray, these are some key points that took my attention. That the diverse political tools that China uses plays a major role in its maritime expansion, its political power projection, and its influence operations in the region. These tools go beyond hard power. There is soft power, and there's even sharp power. And the economic aspect of Southeast Asia's relation to China has a major influence as to the perception that China's rise is an opportunity for member countries' development, but also a threat due to questionable and hostile engagements outside of economics. China's maritime expansion, their military diplomacy, balanced by its cultural influence and soft power relations, allowed it to stay within the gray area without tipping an unfavorable outcome for its part when engaging with member nations in Southeast Asia. But tensions have now spilled over the fifth domain, and this is actually a concern for the Philippines. Emerging threat in the digital space that could attack and influence political and public space. China is using its economic influence, supply chain significance, and soft power relations as a way to minimize the hostile nature of its approach. I believe we should be wary of this. And it reminds me of a commissioned study that we had with Social Weather Station. And I'd like to share it to our participants. Our people, just this July, 77% of them would like China to be made accountable for not immediately sharing their information on COVID-19. And it's a cross-sector. And also, after 4 years, the Filipino people would like our government, the Duterte government, to assert our rights, 7 out of 10 Filipinos, to assert our rights with regards to the West Philippine Sea, our territorial integrity, our maritime rights. And should we build alliances? Of course, we focus on ASEAN today, but in the discussion of Dr. Rene, he mentioned of possible other countries that we can build alliances on. The so-called Quad, India, Japan, Australia, the United States, or we can broaden it even to South Korea and Japan again, New Zealand, or what some would say the Quad Plus. So here we are. We are a country that still believe that we cannot trust China. 8 out of 10 Filipinos historically would say we cannot trust China, given all the efforts by China to expand its influence in the Philippines. As we have entered the 4th year of this administration, let's remind ourselves of that. But from a point of view of ASEAN, I wanted to share these thoughts. The uncertainty of the global order is heavily influenced by the unique characteristics of China's rise. Its calculative approach in navigating to the current order bears the nature of hybrid tactics, where it exploits vulnerabilities through the strategic and opportunistic employment of its power and influence. However, the excessive focus placed on the strategic competition between the US and China has undermined the role of other states in the region. With this, ASEAN has the ability to create a policy environment that balances its interests without undermining the participation of other key players in the region. The future of the regional order should not be determined by the implications of the US-China strategic competition alone. ASEAN and other regional players must recognize their role and step up to promote a multilateral system that integrates any major power capable of disrupting the international order, which is rule-based. The US-China strategic competition provides an opportunity for ASEAN to recalibrate its position, to bridge the gap between great power politicking and on-the-ground realities. I wanted to share this. This was an interview I gave to a Japanese newspaper bureau just last week. And along with this, I'd like again to thank everyone who spoke, who participated, who asked questions. I thank specifically our speakers, and more importantly, as I thank Mary and our partnership with Ernie Bauer, with the Bauer Group Asia, is congratulate Mary with his book. Looking forward that we hope that it reaches through Amazon, the borders of the Philippines, dear book. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard, for moderating.
Thanks, Dindo, Richard,
And
everybody.
stay safe, everyone.
Carpio, Renee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.